Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderón Muñiz.
All right, it's time for blood, sweat, and tears. Or mostly just blood. We're not going to talk much about sweat and tears. We might talk a little bit about tears, actually, now that I think about it. But today's episode of the podcast, we're going to be talking about all things blood. We kind of talked a little bit about blood last week when we talked about bone stuff, because it turns out blood is bone. If you're confused on what that means, maybe watch the previous episode. But we're going to be talking about blood. This is like, Azaii, you and I both kind of agreed on this, that like, this is one of those areas that I feel like is one of the most complex parts of anatomy, right? We were both talking about how like we had to spend a lot of time on this in our own prep. I'll admit fully that this immunology field is my least favorite of all of the anatomy stuff that I had to do in med school. I think it's incredibly important, but it's also so complex and there's so many parts to this. I also know I've talked about my friend Joe a lot on the podcast, but this is his like favorite thing. And I think that might be one of the reasons why we're friends. I'm like, Joe, help me with blood, because he just studies blood cancers as a pathologist. And so pretty excited to dive into this. Hopefully we can remove some of the difficulty here and help you guys so that you don't have to struggle as much as we did when it comes to dealing with blood. But yeah, let's go ahead and dive in.
Yeah. So it's really important. We're primarily going to focus on the immune system, right? So some of these components won't be blood per se, but they help put things into context in terms of how your body will respond to invaders, attackers, all things external, right? Maybe not all things, but most things external.
Yeah.
And so it kind of falls under two main buckets, the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. And so first we're going to talk about the innate immune system. Like what is this, right? And so the innate immune system is essentially the part of your immune system that says, I don't care what you are, stop. Right? Mm-hmm. Stop, drop, and roll.
Yeah.
So this part of your immune system doesn't really care what invader it's seeing, right? Doesn't care what bacteria is trying to infect you, what virus is trying to come your way, right? What parasite is trying to get under your skin. It says, I don't need to have a memory of you, but I need to stop you. And so that's one of the important things about the innate immune system. And that's that it doesn't have a memory. Right. And so this is in contrast to other parts of your immune system that will say, oh, I've seen you before. I know how to respond. And so if you think about what parts of the innate immune system are important, right? Very obvious one, your skin, right? So, you have tons of bacteria on your skin right now. I'm sorry to say it.
That's right. Everyone's getting the heebie-jeebies all of a sudden.
Exactly. If I remember correctly, don't we have more, isn't our microbiome larger than the number of cells in our body? Mostly
not even close.
Yeah. So you're mostly.
Yeah. If you include the cells in your gut, I think 91% of the cells in your body are not human cells. Like the other 9% is human cells. That's kind of weird to think about, but yeah, mostly bacteria.
So you've got plenty of friends on your skin right now. Some of you are going to go want to wash your hands. You need some of these bacteria on your skin. And why is that, right? So your skin, yes, it provides a physical barrier that protects, your body from unwanted bacteria. So if you have a cut, right, you can get an infection, you can get an abscess, but you also have these bacteria that crowd out other ones that are potentially more problematic, right? So the innate immune system, it's a quick response, right? You don't have to wait for it. It doesn't have a memory. And part of that's going to be your skin. And so some of this is going to be physical, some is going to be cell mediated. It's really a very broad range of basically of components. And so you have mechanical parts of your immune system. Sneezing, y'all. Sneezing has a purpose other than just stressing you out when you look up into a light or stressing you out when you get that itch in your nose. I'm like, am I going to sneeze? Am I not going to sneeze? Exactly. Oh, allergy season. No. But if you think about it, it serves a purpose, right? your body is annoyed with the allergen. It has a problem with the allergen. And so you sneeze so that it doesn't constantly keep coming in, right? So the sneezing is a very mechanical protection mechanism. So is cough. And so if you've ever gotten, an upper respiratory infection, you've coughed. And so you cough to get some of these invaders out, right? Now, sometimes that cough is dry, sometimes it's wet. And so there's mucus in it. Mucus is also part of this mechanical protection mechanism because it's going to trap, like physically trap some of the bacteria, et cetera, and expel it when you cough. Now, blood, sweat, and tears. Tears, they are, right? Your tears have a couple of different ways that they help protect you. But one of the ways is that they are literally coming out of your eyes, right? And so that has a mechanical component. Now, tears are cool because they also have a chemical component that protects you. And so tears are going to have enzymes that are going to help protect you against some of these other microbes. Along with tears, there are also enzymes in a couple of other really important places. And your saliva, your mouth, whether you like it or not, has a ton of bacteria as well. And so this is why hopefully everyone is brushing their teeth every day. And so if you think about it, I think have we talked about plaque before? I feel like we have.
Maybe in passing, but
yeah,
it's mostly like bacterial growth and it's like kind of gross, but
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you have some enzymes that break down, that will work to break down some of these microbes, right? So does breast milk. If you think about it, an infant, right, is very prone to the infections from the world around it. And so there has to be some transfers of protection. And so this is one way that the innate immune system can help the infant, right, when breastfeeding. Additionally, your lungs also have antimicrobial peptides, which is really cool because if you think about it, you're breathing in all sorts of things during the day. And so you need to be able to protect your lungs. And sometimes that works out great. And sometimes you end up with pneumonia, right? So it's not perfect. This part of the immune system is strong, it's robust, but it's definitely not perfect, right? Your stomach acid. We've absolutely talked about your stomach acid before. Most things cannot thrive in this super acidic environment, right? And so this is another way that our body says, I'm not interested in getting infected, stay away, right? There is an exception. You don't need to worry about it right now. The other thing that is kind of cool is that your reproductive system also has ways of protecting you from infection. You have acidity in the vagina and zinc in semen. And so your body is trying to protect you from all places, right? And so it's really cool. We've already talked about the microbes and the bacteria on your skin. You also have them in your gut, right? And so in the intestines, it's kind of the same principle, crowding out the invaders, right? Crowding out the ones that are really going to be problematic, like E. coli. You do not want E. coli in, the upper parts of your intestine. Why? Diarrhea. Right? Nobody wants to end up with diarrhea. And so it's really cool because all of this is working together to protect you without you knowing and without needing to have memory, meaning it doesn't have to have seen any of these before.
Yeah. I feel like a good, just kind of overall way to think about this is like our environment, like everything around us, the air, the stuff we touch, right? Everything is filled with possible invaders. And so we need to protect however we can. Skin covers most of it. But there are still some places where bacteria can get in: the mouth, the eyes, the nose, the reproductive organs, right? And so we need ways to specifically fight off stuff in those places. So your tears and the water in your eyes actually contain stuff to kill bacteria. Your nose, your mouth, vagina, everywhere has this way. Every place where you basically have place where bacteria could get in, we've got a way to fight that bacteria, mostly in the ways of like enzymes that can chew up things like lysozyme, but also in some other ways with like you mentioned, mucosal and mechanical ways to kind of fight this off.
And salt.
Yeah, and salt,
Your
right?
skin
And,
is salty, y'all. And that's
right.
part of it, because most bacteria can't thrive. A lot of bacteria can't thrive in a really salty environment.
In a high salinity environment, right? So that's why like sweat, like why you don't get infections just from being sweaty. Side note, that's also how saltwater pools work. Like there's a couple ways to make it so a pool doesn't like grow bacteria and like algae and stuff in it. One is chlorine, or you could do salt water. So like a certain amount of salt in the water will make it so you don't technically need chlorine, like a chlorinated pool. So it's kind of an interesting same idea going on there. But yeah, all of this is pretty big and pretty important. Like if this stuff, most of the time when people think about immune system, they think about like B cells, T cells, like the real like active hunter sort of things. But like your skin is first line of defense, right? Like all of this like mechanical, innate immune system stuff is your first line, right? These are the things that are keeping out 99% of the stuff that's coming your way. It's only when you get something that is particularly cutthroat or particularly brutal, some like bacteria that's figured out a way around these things, that's when you start to need a kind of like specialists, right? Like you need your adaptive immune system, something that can adapt to fight a specific pathogen. And so there's a couple types of these. Most of the time we think, or there's a couple of cells involved in these. B cells and T cells are kind of like the main one. We're talking about antibodies in this area as well. Note that as you get infected, your body will respond to things a little bit differently with like an earlier infection versus a later infection. And so early on, you're going to produce a lot of an antibody called IgM, IG meaning immunoglobulin. I don't know what the M stands for, but something. I always think mega. I know that's definitely not what it comes from. But IgM is like the biggest antibody with the most subunits. And so it's kind of like a monster compared to everything else. And so it might be IG monster. I don't think that's it either. But that's going to be like your first way of learning to kind of like fight off these things. Later on, your body will adapt to IgG or IgE, depending on kind of like what it is that you're fighting kind of overall. But there's also like you mentioned with like breastfeeding stuff, there's antibodies that we use specifically for breastfeeding. So breast milk has IgA, immunoglobulin A in it, which helps you, like that actually passes into the infant. And so now all of a sudden the infant has antibodies in that the infant that the infant didn't make. And so it's able to fight off things even though the infant has never seen these pathogens before. We call this, what's the name for this? This is a passive. Yeah, it's a passive immune system where they are getting antibodies, even though they're not producing them themselves. In theory, this is also something that you could do in humans. Like you could take antibodies from one person and who has seen this disease before and give it to another person. It's not done a whole lot. And as far as like ways for people to fight off things, it's better for me to teach your body how to fight it than to just like take the antibodies and give it to you, which are going to degrade in a pretty short period of time. It's better if you can start to produce your own antibodies, and then I don't have to keep giving you antibodies nonstop all the time. But there are people who have autoimmune disorders, or I guess not really autoimmune disorders, but like a weakened immune system or non-existent in some cases. Like if you have killed off your bone marrow through radiation, relating a little bit to last week's episode. And so there are some things kind of like going on with that as well. But these antibodies essentially will like stick to whatever the pathogen is. And sometimes that just them sticking to the pathogen will inhibit the pathogen from doing what it's trying to do, right? Like if something is trying to bury itself into your cells, but it's covered in all of these antibodies, it can make it hard for it to actually bind the cells that it's trying to get to. And so most of the time, antibodies, we don't think about them as specifically like they are not specifically fighting the cells, it's a lot of times we think about antibodies as just kind of like spray painting, like destroy this thing, right? It's a way for us to tag stuff, or opsonize, which is another fun word that you might see on the MCAT. That's OPSIN, opsin. So you can opsonize something. And that definitely plays a big role in this. Like something that is covered in antibodies is going to be easier for macrophages to engulf. It's going to be easier for neutrophils to attack. And we'll talk about some of these cell types here in a little bit. But just note that we have this adaptive immune system where we can tag things and inhibit their ability to work. One of the main ways that we kind of like start this process is through T cells. Although the antibodies themselves are coming from B cells. We'll talk about B cells here in a second, but I want to take a second and talk about T cells, because it's really, really important that not only can your T cells identify invaders, but it's also really important that they don't identify your cells as invaders. Because you can imagine where something goes wrong here and we start spray painting like all your thyroid cells, like these are invaders, let's kill them and get rid of them. Like that's a problem, right? And so that would be an autoimmune disease where you're attacking yourself. This can also cause, Graves' disease with like the thyroid, or issues with like diabetes, right? Which I know we've talked about in a previous episode, type 1 diabetes, mellitus. And so these are things that you want to kind of understand. And so your T cells actually go through 2 rounds of training in your thymus, which is also something we talked about last week. Oh my God, everything's connecting. Your thymus is, I always think about like T cells are blood cells, right? So they come from bone. But T cells are kind of special because they go to the thymus for training. I always think about like T cells are kind of like the special ones because they go to college, and like all the other ones just like go out into the workforce, get dumped straight into the blood. They don't have to do anything. But T cells go to the thymus where they get like 2 rounds of training, essentially a round of training to like, can you identify invaders? And then also, can you ignore like your normal human cells? And so both of those rounds are pretty important. And there's a whole lot more kind of like layers to that and complexity, but just as an overview, that's what's happening with T cells. Now, we also have a couple types of T cells. We have the helper T cells, which are designed to help other cells identify invaders, right? And then there's the killer T cells, which are some of my favorite cells, mostly because they just have the coolest names. They're the killers, right? And so killer T cells are really interesting because they actually don't fight pathogens. These are kind of like a weird kind of like side area here where these killer T cells kill your cells. And I know a lot of you like Phil, you just said that was bad. Well, it's bad most of the time. Sometimes it's good to kill your cells. And so you want to kind of think about like, when would it be good, right? When would it be good for me to kill some of my cells, right? I think what comes to most students' mind is cancer, right? And so killer T cells can hunt down cells that are replicating when they shouldn't and kill them. Right. And so they'll inject toxins into your cells and kill them, which is really good in the case of like cancer. This is actually just side note. I know all of you guys everyone who's listening to this is almost assuredly going into medicine. Otherwise, you just like listening to me talk. But if you are going into medicine, I think that this is a field of medicine that is going to continue to grow. These immuno-based therapies or immunotherapies, where we can fight cancers with like specially trained T cells and things like that. I think there was an article that I was just reading from last week where there was a trial with this immunotherapy targeting a specific type of rectal cancer. And I think they had 18 patients who all had that. I love Azaii. You're like, yeah, I read this too. I know that if I talk to anyone like my siblings or family, they'd be like, what are you reading for fun? Like, what's wrong with you? I'm like, but there was a trial with this immunotherapy and it had 18 patients with a specific type of rectal cancer. All 18 went into remission. And so like like completely knocked out the cancer for all 18, which is kind of a big deal, right? Like if it knocked out for like 10, like we'd still be like, oh, that's a great study. We've learned a lot. Like this is awesome. But it like did all 18. So it's kind of big news because it had 100% effectiveness on this one specific type of rectal cancer. I always want to like put an asterisk next to this because there's so many types of cancers. And like we hear all like so often about like, oh, this killed all this cancer and like, oh, this will cure cancer. But like there's so many types that like learning to fight each one is a little bit different. But overall, like the whole reason we brought this up is to just show that like this is like understanding how these cells work, how these like killer T cells work is a big field of medicine, a big field of study. And you guys are going to come across this more and more often in medicine in the coming years. But that's not the only thing that killer T cells kill. Also, your cells that have been infected with viruses. So that's kind of like a scorched earth policy thing where like, oh, this cell has been infected with virus and it's starting to like make more viruses. Let's just kill that cell before it spreads the virus. And so that's kind of an interesting thing as well. So these killer Ts are designed to kill your cells, which is kind of interesting. One other little side note. I know a lot of people know that I like neuro, right? I definitely love neuro more than I love immunology. But there is something called a blood-brain barrier. And we actually keep most of our immune cells out of our brain. And it's because neurons don't regenerate. So if these killer T cells killed like a bunch of cells in my liver will just regenerate and it's fine. But if it kills a bunch of cells in my brain, those aren't coming back. And so this is one of the reasons that we separate the blood from the brain. It's because we don't want to let these immune cells into the brain, because if they start to kill cells there, we got a whole other problem, which is why if you get an infection in the brain, it's really hard for your body to fight it off because you don't have your immune system in your brain is way simpler and way weaker than the immune system in the rest of your body. That's how you get like meningitis, either viral or bacterial. And those are kind of bigger deals. But yeah, so note that other stuff kind of going through this. A lot of times we'll like tag these like invaders with these antibodies. And that can also just, I always think about just like spray painting, like destroy this cell. And this also helps the granulocytes, which we'll talk about more here in a little bit, like neutrophils and things like that, add like toxins to like a bacteria to like kill the bacteria. All these, they're called granulocytes because these are immune cells that have little granules is what we call them. Basically, they're just little pockets of stuff, right? That's inside like a vesicle. And so what's in that pocket might be some stuff to activate the immune system, or it might be something to like kill an invader. But whatever it is, we call them granulocytes because site means cells. So these are cells with granulocytes. And so they're going to be able to activate and respond to those antibody tagging.
Yeah, it's really cool. When they release this, what they'll often do is they will basically poke holes in like the plasma membrane, and then it just kind of, right?
Yeah.
Probably not the best terminology, but like license, right?
Yeah.
And so it's actually really cool when you think about what these cells are capable of. Again, like the human body's just a wonder. But a couple of notes on some of what we talked about. So like you were saying, the IVIG, you didn't say that, but we can give people antibodies from someone else, but we're going, like you said, it's not as helpful as if your body learns to do it yourself. So what will often happen is we'll do this for really severe diseases, and you'll hear it called IVIG. The reason I'm bringing this up is you'll probably see it in the media. It's been talked about very, very much recently, given the ongoing pandemic. But this is going to provide like some passive immunity. And so there are lots of conditions where if it gets bad enough, we'll do this, right? And like you were saying, modulating the immune system or immunomodulation is huge in autoimmune disorders. It's being considered in all sorts of illnesses. And so you'll come across this quite a bit. And what's really interesting is that the MCAT has a ton of ways that they can test you on this, right? They could ask you about a specific cell. They could give you like something you haven't seen before, like a medication, or talk about a cancer, or talk about a gene, and ask you to understand, okay, how does this relate to the immune system on a general level? And so you could be exposed to something that you're unfamiliar with, but be expected to extrapolate it to the immune system in general, right? For context, the reason that in addition to, potentially like having cured these folks or have helped these folks get into remission for cancer, the study that you were talking about, for reference, people have to get large parts of their colon and intestines removed, and then they start chemo and radiation. And so this is like very heavy for people to deal with. And so as science continues to progress and the medical field and medical research continues to progress, if this is something you're interested in, I would encourage you to keep this in the back of your mind, because there's a lot of interesting components. Now, you don't need to know that study for the MCAT, right? Or the specifics of any of that, but just thinking about the general overarching reason behind why this might work is important, and helps you put things into context for the MCAT.
Yeah, especially because I feel like, I know I've talked about this before, but the MCAT doesn't, they don't create these articles that you are seeing on the test on their own. These are articles that are really published. This is published data from journal articles. And so topics that have a lot more research in them are more likely to show up on test day, just because there's more articles on, there's more journal articles. So I think cancer, obviously there's so much study on this, but because this is kind of like the cutting edge of trying to figure out how to fight cancer, and it has been for a little bit, and there's been a lot of advances in this, I think you're actually kind of likely to see a passage about immunotherapies for cancer. I think you're pretty likely to see that on test day. And so making sure you understand that will help you deal with those passages better, because you'll kind of understand or have a rough idea of how it works before you even get into the passage and start reading it.
Exactly. And having that is a huge advantage, right? Mm-hmm. on test day. So we talked about the T cells, and we're going to talk about another part of the adaptive immune system that you already talked a little bit about, Phil, but B cells, right? So B cells made in the bone marrow. We talked about this last week. But so these are going to be what really remembers what you see, right? So we said innate immune system, it doesn't care what it's coming across. It's just going to react. Whereas the B cells, they're going to say, okay, have I seen this before or not? And whether they've seen it before or not determines their response. And so these helper T cells, right, they're going to, the ones that you were talking about, they're going to give the signal to the B cells, hey, I need you to differentiate. I need you to recognize this antigen, right, this part of the pathogen. And so the B cells, once they're activated, that first exposure to a pathogen, it needs to wake up, right, so to speak. So it's going to take that first time that you see a new pathogen, it's going to be a longer response time. And the reason that it's a longer response time is that once that B cell recognizes the pathogen, it needs to start making these antibodies, right? It's never seen it before, so it's not just going to release a ton of antibodies the second it sees it. So once it recognizes it, it's going to produce those IgM antibodies. And so, like you were saying, they have these extra, they have multiple antibodies connected to one another. And so the reason I think about, or the way I think about this is they want to grab everything that they can because it's their first response. They're like, oh my gosh, I got to stop this. So that's the way that I like to think about why they have more pentamers is what they're called.
They are pentamers.
Yeah, right. They are pentamers. That's what I meant to say. So once they do that though, they want to be more effective. Right. And so they also want to create that memory, the B cells. And so what they're going to do is they're going to class switch, meaning they will go from some of them, not all of them, some of them will go from making IgM, they'll undergo some recombination, and they'll start producing IgG antibodies. And so these are going to be those longer term antibodies and protection. So those are essentially going to help with memory. Now, we said these B cells, they kind of have different antibodies, but there are also different types of B cells. There are the plasma cells, and then there are going to be the memory cells, right? So the plasma cells, their job is to just release antibodies like crazy in order to tag them, in order to bind them, in order to make the immune system and the immune response even more robust, right? Because all parts of your immune system are working together at this point to neutralize the pathogen and make you healthy again. The memory cells, their job is going to be, if you see this pathogen again, we're going to have a faster response. Why is it faster? Because I've already seen it. So I don't have to, and my body doesn't have to create a new response from scratch. And so it's really, this is kind of the basis for vaccines, right? In a vaccination, generally speaking, you're either going to have a neutralized, for example, a neutralized virus, or you might have just bits and pieces of an antigen. And so your body is first going to have, it's smaller immune response. It's not going to infect you, right? So that's why you don't get sick and you don't get measles when, you get the vaccine. But then now your body has created a memory via these B cells. And so if you happen to come across, this pathogen again, body's like, oh, I can do something about this. I've seen it before, right? So basis for vaccinations, it also produces like this response and this natural immunity when you've just come across other people that are sick, right? So if you think about little kids, they are constantly getting sick, especially in the first few years of life, right? Think about it. They have to build their immune system from scratch. Yeah. Yes, they got some passive immunity from mom or through breast milk, but they don't have that anymore. Right. And so everything they come across, we have to build memory for. Yeah. So that's why little kids seem like they're always perpetually sick. Now, that you don't need to know for the MCAT, it's just good context. So the key there is just this creation of memory. And this is really an important component of your immune system, or your adaptive immune system.
Yeah, I just want to kind of take a second and shine a light on how awesome vaccinations are. Just kind of overall, we were talking about how we could give antibodies, but antibodies do not last very long, right? And so if we could help protect people and make them so they wouldn't get diseases, but we'd have to give them a shot every 2 or 3 days. And that doesn't work with giant populations. It's way better to just teach them to make the antibodies themselves. And that's where vaccinations come in. There are I can't imagine what the world would look like without vaccines. They are literal lifesavers. So I think I'm preaching to the choir here in this case, but obviously vaccines are great. I do want to take a second because the MCAT has tested some weird things with vaccines kind of in the past. If there is a bacteria or something that produces some proteins and those proteins make you sick, right? I could inject you with those proteins and you would start to learn to fight them because you would identify them as foreign. But if those proteins are what makes you sick, I kind of don't want to inject those into you because not only will you will learn to fight it, but it will also make you sick, right? So what you kind of want to do with a vaccine is figure out some part of this bacteria or some part of this pathogen that doesn't actually make you sick, but you can still learn to fight it. And so you kind of want to inject those into people and they'll learn to fight it, but it won't actually make them sick overall. Obviously, those things they're using for the vaccine have to be proteins or things that are on the outside of the bacteria. If there's some weird protein inside the bacteria, your antibodies are never going to hit that. So it's got to be something on the exterior. And hopefully something that isn't super close to your cells. So you talked about the B cells. Basically what your body does is it takes, when your body's trying to learn how to fight something, it finds an antigen and then just runs around to every single B cell in your lymphatic tissue. And it's hey, you B cell A, can you fight this thing? Nope. Okay. B cell B, B cell C. I shouldn't be using letters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, B cell 3, B cell 4, B cell 5, and just goes through this until it gets to B cell 972. Oh, you can fight this. You need to turn on, and they amplify, and that B cell will replicate and start to produce a bunch of antibodies. Now it's really, I know a lot of times people are why don't just all of your antibodies get super active all the time, all your B cells? Well, One, that takes a whole lot of energy. Like your immune system is that's why one of the reasons why people get so tired and also so hungry when they are sick, or at least especially when they're healing, right? It's because your immune system is kicking butt and it's like super active, and that's burning a lot of energy. But also, like, if you started producing all these antibodies, some of them might attack your stuff. And so we don't want to like start to produce a bunch of antibodies until we know there is a pathogen that we can target with this. And so one of the interesting things kind of relating to this, I was just talking to someone else about this, but there is a tick that can like bite you, and like some of the proteins in its saliva, because it like has stuff to like kind of numb your skin so you don't notice it's there. And also like some proteins in there to increase blood flow and to not cause like vasoconstriction, to like make sure that the tick is getting the blood that it's trying to drink. I know it's kind of gross, but some of those proteins, your body can learn to fight that because those proteins make it into your bloodstream, and it can learn to attack specifically the proteins. And that does nothing to the tick because the proteins just go into the blood. So this isn't actually helping you fight off ticks or anything. It's just like fighting off that one protein that's in the tick spit, if that makes sense. But there is like this protein is actually really similar to what's found in red meat, like beef and things like that. And so people who get bit by a tick and start to produce antibodies against that protein in the tick saliva, they like amplify that B cell and they produce a whole bunch of antibodies. Now those people have immune responses to meat, to like red meat. So these people can't eat like a hamburger because it will make them sick, because their body will identify the hamburger as foreign and like activate the immune system. And so they have like a full-fledged like reaction, like allergic reaction to the meat itself. And so this is one of those cases of like why we don't want to do this all the time, because if all your B cells did this all the time, then like you would be attacking and fighting everything, even the stuff that you don't necessarily need to. So it's kind of an interesting thing kind of overall. Now, when we look at this immune system, right, there's a couple of categories. This is actually what really confused me more than anything, because like, is this cell a leukocyte? Is it a lymphocyte? Is it like a myeloid? Like, what kind of cells are these? And so I just want to kind of like clarify this a little bit. So all white blood cells are like leukocytes, right? That's the definition of like what's going on with them. The ones that like hang out in your lymphatic tissue, your B cells and your T cells, those are lymphocytes, which are types of leukocytes. You also have like immune cells that are not lymphocytes, things that are just like floating around in your blood, like neutrophils, eosinophils, like macrophages, right? That can just like engulf a bacteria. So those are called myeloid cells. And so we have this kind of like characterizations. There are like things, as you are studying this, you've probably heard some of these terms, or like you've almost certainly heard of like certain cancers, like leukemia or lymphomas, or maybe even acute myeloid leukemia, AML, right? And so those are telling you what kind of cells and like what sort of lineages that are actually like causing the cancer issues, right? Like, is this a cancer of the cells that make B cells and T cells? That would be a lymphoma. Is it one that is more like what becomes like, you know, the myeloid cells? And that would be a leukemia, but it would be specifically a myeloid leukemia. I think technically a lymphoma is a leukemia, but like we always just call it a lymphoma because it's more specific overall. You can correct me if I'm a little iffy on this, Azaii.
Yeah, like the you can have like now the word is failing me. ALL, like acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So that's right. Going to be still the lymphoid lineage. So basically like the middle letter will tell you, but lymphoma is like lymphoblasts. And so we'll talk about that in a bit.
Right. And so there's these different kind of like lineages, because there's lots of types of white blood cells. It's not just one type of, like, obviously the B cells and T cells, which we've talked about, but then there's this whole other type of cells. And so this is also a part of your innate immune system, but it's the cell mediated immune system. It's not the adaptive immune system. This is stuff that doesn't care what it's fighting, but it's going to just fight anything, right? So like we have like lots of different cells in here, like the different myelocytes we have that are like have the granules, like we kind of talked about. They're the eosinophils, which help with like parasites is the way I like to think about it. So like for some reason, E equals parasite in my brain. So eosinophils are for parasites. Also immunoglobulin E or IgE, that's also for parasites. Basophils do some stuff with allergies. So do eosinophils as well. Same as mast cells. Mast cells also help you kind of like activate your immune system with like allergies. Note that they're found in different regions of the body, right? Like the cells in your intestines are different than the cells in your nose, right? And so I think you have more mast cells in your intestine, more basophils in your nose, but like don't take that to the bank. The MCAT is not going to test you on like where are you going to find high quantities of mast cells. But they're kind of in different areas overall. And so you have these kind of to blame for when you have allergies, right? Like some piece of pollen from a tree goes in your nose and your body's like, invader. And like your basophils like kick out all this stuff to like activate your immune system and help you like, kind of ramp it up. But there's also things like neutrophils, which are generally used for like killing bacteria and also fungi. And just kind of like those like slightly more complex invaders. And then monocytes, these are like macrophages. So monocytes actually can become macrophages. Monocytes can become a lot of things. And there's lots of things that monocytes are like eater things. Like you have these in your lungs. Actually, we talked about it last week, but osteoclasts, the things that degrade your bone, those actually are monocytes. And so that's actually a white blood cell thing that a monocyte turns into an osteoclast to help kind of dissolve and eat your bone, just like a macrophage eats a bacteria. And so all of these are myeloid cells. All of these are myelocytes. Specifically, I think all of those, except for the monocyte, are granulocytes. They release granules overall. Macrophages, they don't release granules. They just go around eating stuff. That's okay. The killer cells have a better name, but like macrophage is like my second best name because macro means big and phage means eat. And so macrophages are the big eaters. It's actually the name of the cells. And like, that's pretty cool. There are other tissues. There are other like cells in your blood though. So like red blood cells, like we haven't been talking about that much, but red blood cells also come from bone, and these are myeloid in origin. You also have your megakaryocytes. These are like giant cells that are made in your bone marrow, and then they burst into fragments, and we just dump the fragments into the blood. And so in your blood are a bunch of just like chunks of a giant dead cell. That's actually what platelets are. So platelets are actually just pieces of cells that are floating around in your blood. And we use those to, produce clots, right? So if I get like a cut and like an artery is like spilling blood out to the outside, it's kind of weird, but we just take like chunks of cells and pack them in there along with some like fibrous stuff known as fibrin and like thrombin. And like, there's a whole like cascade there with like clotting that we're not going to go into at this point, but note that that's what happens with blood clots. And it's actually made of blood cells. And that's where megakaryocytes fit in. So just to overall kind of cover this, because I know this is the sort of thing that caused me a lot of confusion. Leukocytes, that includes like lymphoid cells and myeloid cells. And the myeloid cells, you have all those parts of your innate cell-mediated immune system, like eosinophils, basophils, mast cells, neutrophils, macrophages, monocytes, all of those. You also have your red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes, and you have your megakaryocytes, which you won't see those floating around in blood, but you'll see chunks of them floating around in blood, and that is platelets.
Yeah. Fun fact. So tattoos. If anyone has tattoos, the really cool thing. So why doesn't, they're putting ink into your body. Why doesn't it just float away? Like how does the tattoo actually stay there? It's the macrophages. So the really cool thing is that there are some macrophages that circulate in the body and there are some that reside in tissue. And so some of the macrophages are hanging around in your skin and they say, oh, this ink is foreign. What is it? I'm just gonna close it off, right? Exactly. I'm going to eat it. I'm going to close it off. I'm going to make sure that it doesn't attack anything, right? Because it doesn't know the difference. And so that's why, since they're just hanging around, right? That's why your tattoo doesn't just spread out as soon as you get it.
Dilute
so
in your body.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, the reason that the tattoo doesn't just move around is because that version of the macrophages are staying in the tissue, whereas there are other macrophages that are circulating. So
I feel like kind of an interesting thing with that is also like macrophages don't have an infinite lifespan. So they will die and what's inside will spill out, but then another macrophage will just eat it. But in that time frame, that's actually why tattoos get a little bit blurrier. If you've had a tattoo for 50 years, it's a little bit blurrier than the day you got it, is because the macrophage engulfs it, holds it in that spot, but then it'll die and it'll drift a little bit, and then another macrophage will eat it. And then it'll die and drift a little bit, and another macrophage will eat it. So that's why tattoos get blurry also in there.
Yeah. And like we talked about, right? So we have this myeloid lineage. And even though red blood cells and platelets aren't, part of the immune system per se, we felt that it was important to discuss them because they're part of the same lineage. You will get questions, right? On red blood cells. I've definitely seen a question on platelets. So all of this is fair game. Now, like you were saying, Phil, we don't expect to see megakaryocytes in a regular blood draw, right? That would be a sign that, hey, there's a problem because the body's trying to just send out whatever it can. Similarly, if you have red blood cells that aren't completed, right? They haven't completed their process of just kicking out, the
maturation, they're not quite mature.
Exactly. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. If you see that in the blood smear, that's a problem. Similarly, in these leukemias that we were talking about, often what they'll see is, yes, the amount of these cells is high in the blood, but so are these immature cells, right? Because the body's just I'm just producing like crazy. And so that's something that, again, you can just use a very common test to figure out, oh, hey, there's a problem, right? That common test that we talked about last week was just a complete blood count, right? It's something that basically everybody who goes to the ED for any sort of illness gets it. We just kind of throw those around.
That's funny. I feel like my friend Joe, who I know I talk about all the time as a pathologist, I feel like he's going to say, wait, that's not a simple thing. It's simple for other doctors to say, I want a CBC and I want you to identify stuff. But a pathologist, which some of you guys listening may become, it's going to be your job to take a blood smear and look at it under a microscope and figure out what cell is this? Is this a basophil? Is this a mast cell? Is I can tell there's granules, and not only figure out what cell is it, but also figure out is this an older one? Is this an immature one? Staging this basophil, and there might be 3 to 5 different stages and categories of basophil in here, which is why I feel like my friend Joe would be like, no, this is really hard and really important. But for most doctors, we just say I want a CBC. Can somebody tell me what we see in this? And then you get a report and you're like, okay, this is what's in the blood.
Yeah. To clarify, the reason a CBC is easier is it's automated.
Yes.
Right? So what your friend Joe is doing is a lot more intensive than with these machines.
Identifying specifically when something's wrong, then you send it to the pathologist hey, figure out what's going on here.
Exactly. And that's the cool thing, right? You have the opportunity to get suspicious, in these other fields, and then you send it out to a specialist and okay, what's actually going on? Because sometimes things are not always what they appear, right? And so just a quick plug for the interconnectedness of different specialties in medicine. You are always working on a team, whether or not you are the only physician directly seeing this patient, right? Mm-hmm. There is a group of people that are working together to make sure that they can diagnose the patient appropriately, treat the patient appropriately, et cetera. So just always remember to be kind to the people around you and be kind to the people who work with you. But anyway, side note aside.
Just kind of you were talking about the immature stuff. I know I've talked about it. Like I've been doing a lot of hiking this this spring, and so I went on a hike in the mountains, and I was having a real hard time breathing. And so what my body will do will increase the amount of red blood cells because I need it to breathe better because there's not enough oxygen in the environment. So a lot of times my body will release a bunch of immature red blood cells, because like I need it quickly and I don't have time to like have these fully mature. So it'll release them. They're kind of like in an earlier stage. Just a side note, the hormone that your body releases to increase red blood cells is called erythropoietin. Let me actually spell that. Just erythropoietin or something like that. Erythropoietin. I think there might be some more vowels in there. But this hormone is helping you raise the number of red blood cells in your body. And so if somebody did a blood draw on me right as I was like climbing a mountain at elevation for the first time, and they started to look at it, some people might be like, ooh, there's something weird going on here in this guy. Like he's got a lot of young, immature red blood cells. There might be an indication of like a blood cancer or something kind of going on here. But no, it's just, I just like all of a sudden needed a ton more red blood cells. And so my body was trying to adapt to that. Now, if I lived at elevation and I did a lot of hiking, then like my body has time to mature a lot of those red blood cells because I'm always in the same scenario. And so you would actually see a difference in somebody who like drove from sea level up into the mountains and went hiking versus someone who lived in the mountains and went hiking. Like their blood would be different, which is kind of interesting when you kind of like looking at what's going on. You could tell like, was somebody, what was going on there. I feel like that would be really good for like a forensics cop TV show where they like, we took a blood sample and we noticed a lot of immature red blood cells. So our killer is not from the mountains, even though the murder was done in the mountains. And like, I feel like there could be something going on there.
I mean, I don't think that would be the most far-fetched thing in the world. But maybe it's also someone that got a bone marrow transplant. And so the wrong person is getting identified.
Yeah. Someone should hire me to write for CSI. We'll do some blood-based episodes.
It'd be pretty fun. And the body responds really well to stressors. And so similar to how the body responds to decreased oxygen when an increased demand, when you're hiking and when you're going to higher elevations, it also does something really similar in pregnancy. And so what's really interesting is that, yes, the amount of red blood cells in your body increases, but the volume of blood increases more. And so people will often look like they're anemic in pregnancy. And it's not anemia in the traditional sense. It's actually just because it's been diluted. So we call that physiologic anemia. If you see physiologic in something, it means it's not really a problem. It just kind of happens and your body is doing it naturally.
Yeah, it's a normal physical version of something that could be pathological in other people. Yeah.
Exactly. So we've talked about the myeloid lineage. So now we're going to talk about the lymphoid lineage. And again, this kind of idea of lymphoma that you were talking about, it's this lineage, right? It's the lymphatic system, and often with something like a lymphoblast. So what is a lymphoblast, right? A lymphoblast is this precursor cell. And you've heard us talk about precursor cells, even if I don't think we've used the exact word. Those are going to be those cells that can differentiate into other types of cells, right? So we're ultimately going to have B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes, or B cells and T cells. And so we already kind of talked about this, right? The B cells, these are going to be eventually the plasma cells, the memory cells. So quick quiz yourself. What is a plasma cell and what is a memory cell, right? So plasma releasing all of the antibodies, memory cell, as the name implies, it's the one that's going to have the memory and is going to cause differentiation when you see the pathogen again. Yeah. And then with the T
memory cells tend to be less active overall. Correct. And they just kind of like holding on until they get a signal of like, oh yeah, that thing's back. We need to fight it again.
Exactly. The plasma cells are the ones that you're going to really see during an infection. And what's really cool is that you can actually differentiate these cells, like you were saying, on a blood smear. So you can actually have an idea of what's going on while while someone is having an infection or is ill. What's also really cool is that the B lymphocytes, we said that they produce IgM and IgG, right? And IgM is this first response, and IgG is you're either much later in the course. I think they start getting produced like close to 10 days or so. Mm-hmm. You might see it as early as like 4 or 5, but generally speaking, it'll be a little later. And then it's also used to recognize an earlier infection. And so when, we may not look at the B cells directly, but we'll look at what they produce. And so one way that you can tell if someone is currently infected versus has an older infection is look at the antibodies for that illness. So for example, for Epstein-Barr, EBV, which is mononucleosis, like you can see, okay, they don't have IgM, but they do have IgG. Oh, they're not currently sick, right? Like they had a previous exposure, or they're not actively exposed. They had a previous exposure. Whereas if you see that, oh, they have both IgM and IgG, right? Even though you're not measuring the B cells directly, you're like, oh, they're actively sick, right? And so that's another really cool way that knowing what these cells are and what they produce and their function can help you in everyday medical life and medical career.
I feel like all of our discussions have made me like blood a whole lot more. Maybe it's just because all of my professors just talked about it through like a list form, but like starting to realize like but just by looking at someone's blood, you can tell like, have they recently been to the mountains? Like are they sick with something? And if they are sick, is it the first time they've had that disease, or have they had this disease before in the past? Right? Like, do they have a parasite? Right? Mm-hmm. Like what's going, like all of these are things that you can figure out just by looking at the blood. And so like maybe it's a lot more interesting than I like initially like kind of dive into it, but there's a lot you can tell from blood. Maybe I just needed a better blood teacher in the past, because like now that we're talking about it, I'm getting excited. Like I need to research blood more.
This is why I was a little sad when we were first talking and you're like, oh yeah, I don't really like the immune system. I'm like, no, we have to do one on the immune system. It's so much fun.
I think it was just that I had been taught like I have to identify all of these cells and all of these stages, and like identify like an early immature, medium immature, late immature, early mature, like all of these different categories of these. And all of a sudden it's just like, I feel like I'm just memorizing a bunch of stuff, and you will have to do that in med school. Mm-hmm. But note that this information gives you a lot of information about a patient and kind of like what's going on with them overall.
Exactly. And this is why we've said this before, right? Our goal is, yes, to help you do really well and the best you can on the MCAT. Our goal is also, perhaps unlike other
MCAT podcasts or other prep stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. Part of our goal is also to make sure that you are prepared for when you get to medical school and learning how to rethink, right, what you have in front of you, which yes, will help you for the MCAT, because MCAT is mostly application, right? Learning, and yes, some memorization, but also a lot of application. And being able to transfer that over when you get to medical school. Because yes, you will need to memorize things when you are in medical school. That will be, quite a bit of the foundation, but you also need to be able to make those connections, right? You cannot practice medicine in a fact-only void. You need to be able to make those connections, because being able to make those connections is what's going to help you identify what a patient's coming in with, what the appropriate treatment is, what the appropriate follow-up is, what other specialists might need to get involved. And so it's really important to keep that in mind. And you'll notice that, yes, we're talking about some of what you need to memorize and learn, but also the why and the connections. It's really important.
It's that why and those connections that make it so that like there are times when like computers overall are way better at memorizing facts and regurgitating them out than people are. But this is why we have job security as physicians, right? This is why this is important. Like the job can't just be done by a computer, because you need to understand like how these things are connected, because you are going to see a lot of things that are presenting in not the textbook case, right? And so it's not just, oh, if we see this, it means this always, right? There's a lot of things like if a patient had been to the mountains recently, all of a sudden, like the high levels of immature erythrocytes is kind of expected and maybe a little bit normal. And so trying to understand like how all these pieces fit together, understand how it works and like the implications of these helps paint like a bigger picture, and you can understand how all of this works as one, right? Because as you mentioned earlier, like the human body is amazing, right? It's a wonder. And so just trying to understand how all these pieces fit together is something that can be like a little bit interesting. I mean, we haven't even talked about this, but like just tying this into like metabolism and the digestive system, right? Like when you have low metabolism, your immune system like is very energy intensive. And so your immune system drops, right? And so if you are like hungry or like stressed, and like things will change with your metabolism that affect your immune system. But also just food, because like red blood cells need iron. And so if you don't have enough iron in your diet, like all of a sudden your red blood cell levels will be off. And so it's not a disease, it's not cancer, it's just you don't have the right food. And so understanding how all these pieces kind of fit together is something that takes a little bit to get going. But hopefully this podcast is helping you make those connections overall, as well as obviously helping you prepare for the MCAT. So if you see a megakaryocyte, you should be thinking clotting, like platelets, things like that, because that is absolutely something the MCAT will test you on.
Yeah. And kind of wrapping us up with the T cells, because I don't want us to forget about the T cells while we're talking about all these other things. So like we talked about the T cells, there are two main types, right? They're the helper T cells. You might also see these called CD4. Right. And this is kind of a marker that we use to identify the different types of cells. We actually have quite a few markers that we use for our immune cells that we use to identify them. But this is the one for helper T cells. And then CD8 is for the cytotoxic T cells. Right. Now, we already talked about kind of what they do. You're also going to have memory T cells. So the same way, because we talked about how the adaptive immune system is a memory-based immune system, as well as, humoral and cell-based, the T lymphocytes the T cells will also have a memory component. There's also, and this is much, much less likely to get tested, but we also have regulatory T cells. And so we have to have this balance of activation and telling our immune system chill, right? Yeah. And this kind of negative regulation. So really what you're more likely to see are the helper T cells, the cytotoxic, the B cells. Those you're more likely to see than regulatory. Shout out to the natural killer cells, which are different. This always tripped me up, right? So these are not memory based. They always trip me up. They have a lot of overlap with the cytotoxic T cells. And so that was something that I struggled with. But these are going to also be killing, some tumors, some virally infected cells, et cetera. So kind of recapping, because we've talked about so much, overarching recap. So there are two main components of your immune system, right? There's the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. The innate immune system says, I don't care what this is, it's a problem, I'm going to try and stop it. And so this is going to be things like your skin, right? The salt and that salinity on your skin. It's going to be mechanical components like coughing and mucus and sneezing, right? It's going to be chemicals. So the antimicrobial peptides in your lung, the really acidic stomach, right? Mm-hmm. Good luck even doing anything in there other than digestion, and a little bit of digestion and killing off microbes. And then you're going to have the commensal flora, right? Like in your GI, in your guts. This is where things like, and we didn't talk about this, but like antibiotics, a lot of times people will get GI symptoms because you're killing off the commensal bacteria, right? And so we also talked about the adaptive immune system. So T cells, B cells, these are going to have humoral components. So like the antibodies getting released by the B cells, they're also going to have memory components. So they do care what you've seen before. And this is the basis for vaccination. It's the basis for immunity after you've seen an illness a couple of times, or sometimes even just once. And then we've also talked about the different lineages. So we talked about the lymphoid lineages, but also the myeloid lineage. So thinking about red blood cells, platelets, not part of the immune system, but still really important. And you could very well get asked questions on the MCAT. And then things like the neutrophils, the monocytes, the macrophages, the eosinophils, etc. I would try and remember what they do. Some of them have really strong overlap. And so if you just remember the cluster, you'll be fine for the MCAT, right?
Yeah.
I don't think we talked about this, but the dendritic cells, I just think of them as like they have lots of dendrites and they're trying to present antigens. So one other thing, but there's a lot of connections. Quiz yourself. Try and, ask, okay, what did I just learn? And try and, talk about it for a few minutes. And that can be a great way to make sure that you're on the right track. As always,
I was going to say one more thing, just to kind of like recap, the innate immune system is not just that like skin sort of stuff, like stuff on the outside, but also the cell mediated innate immune system. So like your neutrophil doesn't care what bacteria it's fighting. It just fights bacteria. Your eosinophil doesn't care what parasite is fighting. It just fights parasites. And so note that those cells, like, the basophils, the mast cells, eosinophils, macrophages, like all the monocyte stuff, I feel like I'm missing one, eosinophil, like all of those are also part of the innate immune system, but specifically they're cell mediated. Like it's a cell that does this, which is different than like your skin, which is made of cells, but it's not a cell. And like the enzymes in your tears and saliva and stuff like that, like that's not a cell. That's just a different way that we learn to fight those things.
Yeah. And again, like it's very helpful if you can sit down and just kind of like list, and then you can say, okay, what's part of the innate immune system and then what's part of the adaptive immune system, right? And the name tells you the adaptive adapts to what it's seeing. Innate is just like, I'm just tackling everything I can get my hands on. And we also talked a little bit about the complement, right, with the opsonization. So that's something really cool to look into, just poke holes, right? But there's a lot here. So we encourage you to try and think about it. You can also try and test yourself by thinking about, okay, AML versus ALL and the leukemias, what we would expect. Another way to quiz yourself is if I have a problem with, neutrophils, what types of infections might I get? And again, this is something that you can work your way backwards just to practice and make sure you're on the right track. All right. As always, you are welcome to go to our homepage, check out the AMC outline that we have where we talk about a lot of these in written form. Our podcast is always here for listening. Lots of practice questions on our website as well. Academic advisors can't stress enough how awesome they are, both as human beings and also as someone to kind of help orient you during your MCAT journey. And, if you need additional resources, they'll point you to them. If you're trying to decide whether you should test now or retake or postpone, they're also great with all of that. So we encourage you to check out the website and look at all of the resources.